Hi, my name is Dr. Joyce Alberts, clinical psychologist working in private practice, North Canterbury, New Zealand. I've just started making my video again. I was just rambling on for about 10 minutes or so, and I looked down and I noticed that my microphone, I'm not sure, oh, that's not going to show. Um, my fancy microphone was switched on. So when I checked the recording, all of the brilliant things I was saying are not being recorded. No, they're not brilliant. But I'm chuckling to myself because it's such a blonde thing to do, isn't it? So I just want to go back and just recap what I was rambling on about. I've been posting a series of videos around the tragic death of John O'Keefe and then the subsequent trials of his girlfriend, Karen Reid. You might be wondering why, as a clinical psychologist in New Zealand, that I might be interested in a trial that's occurring over in the United States. And there's a variety of reasons that I became interested in this. One of the reasons for that was during the first trial, it became aware the complexity of the relationships between people involved in this case, that the fact that John O'Keefe was a Boston police officer and he was found deceased on the front lawn of a fellow Boston police officer, that the police in their investigation had not entered the house of 34 Fairview Lane to do an investigation. The key witnesses who were present at the time of John O'Keefe's death were interviewed in their own homes and often with multiple people present during those interviews. Those interviews were not recorded by the police, and yet other interviews were. And then to find out during the trial that the lead investigator, the former trooper, Michael Proctor, now disgraced trooper, not disgraced Michael Proctor, talk about that in some more detail at another time, um, actually was close friends with a number of the witnesses, a number of the people who were present and involved. So this conflict of interest really seemed to taint the entire investigation. But I also had talked about wanting to compare and make notes comparing the first trial with the second trial. So the first trial, where Karen Reid is alleged to have caused the death of her boyfriend, John O'Keefe, by reversing her SUV into him 26 miles an hour, causing his death and leaving his body unattended, alone outside overnight during a snowstorm. Karen Reid is charged with murder. She's also charged with manslaughter as an option for the jury. And I became interested in this, as I said, partly because of the complexity of the dynamics going on in the relationships of certain people and then what happened afterwards with those relationships, but also because of the testimony that was evident, the pattern of testimony or evidence given during both trials. So the distinct pattern I noted, and this is not specific per se to this trial or to Karen Reid's trials, it, it is a pattern that I've seen myself as I've appeared as an expert witness in court, and I then would sit and hear the evidence of others. So the pattern is that under direct examination, the answers given are succinct, they're detailed, they flow in a logical sequence, and then a pattern changes under cross-examination, where now there's hesitancy, stammering over words, stop, start, and then the fallback, I don't know, I do not recall, I can't remember. And this became really evident in this trial, more so than what I've seen in other trials or I've seen myself personally in the work that I do. So I also took a look at the evidence of certain people and how they might be challenged about what they've said at a certain point in time. And then later on, they either don't recall or they say something different. So as a clinical psychologist, part of my training has been to conduct master's and PhD research. My particular area that I was interested in was a specific category of error in memory, often referred to as a false memory. So there are many different types of memory errors. You can conflate information, so mix up two pieces of information and come out with a third piece. You could forget information or forget events. But I was looking at what's referred to as a false memory. And this is defined as information that is related but irrelevant to what's occurred, leaks into or intrudes into memory. So my particular study, I was looking at whether I could identify those who have good inhibitory control from those who have poor inhibitory control, and whether those with poor inhibitory control were more susceptible to this specific error in memory, a false memory. So the reason I'm looking at inhibitory control is that information is stored in the brain through patterns of neural activity. So our memory traces do not occur just in or stored in one, if you like, vault in the brain. A memory trace may involve visual memory or visual processing of information, auditory, what we heard, maybe involve the language areas because we might be able to name what we've seen as we talk about our memory. And so complex areas of the brain are involved in a pattern which is then related to a memory trace. So a basic example would be if I said, I remember the time I cut an orange open and I could smell the fresh orange. So as I recall that memory, the color orange is activated, the name of orange is activated, the smell of orange is activated, and maybe even some other events related to my action of cutting an orange open. So, for example, if I asked you to recall a specific meal that you've had, say, for example, during the week, you had told me you had this delicious spaghetti bolognese. And now I say, oh, could you tell me what that spaghetti bolognese was like? Could you tell me about that meal? So as you recall that specific meal and that specific spaghetti bolognese, you have to inhibit recollection or activation of other incidents of having spaghetti bolognese or spaghetti itself or pasta itself or mince itself or who else might have been at that meal or other times that you've had a meal similar to that with people like that. So there's a lot of inhibitory control required to accurately recall information. And in the work I do as a clinical psychologist, constructs such as credibility, validity, reliability, accuracy are really important. And if people are asked to give evidence in court, they're asked to tell the truth, so say what happened, the whole truth, don't leave out aspects of what happened, and nothing but the truth. So don't make up things, don't add things in that didn't occur. The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And this is where, for myself, and as a clinical psychologist, the issue around eyewitness testimony and its reliability and validity relates to the era of false memories. So come back to this particular trial. So one of the people that I wanted to talk about today, and he really caught my attention, was Timothy Nuttall. He gave evidence at the first and second trial. In an earlier video, I said that I was going to construct a list of the names of people who gave evidence at the first trial and then compare that with who gave evidence at the second trial. And you will see there's a distinct difference. So Timothy Nuttall did give evidence at both trials. The first trial held in 2024, and the second trial held in 2025. Timothy Nuttall was a firefighter and paramedic, and he worked for the Canton Fire Department. So different from our systems here in New Zealand, where we have a separate ambulance service, St. John's, and we have a separate fire department. So in many places in America, the two are the same, and that the fire service is often the first ones on scene and the first one it's called, whether it's a motor vehicle accident, injuries caused to a person, or the unattended death of a person. So Timothy Nuttall and two of his other colleagues, they arrived on scene first, and they attended to John O'Keefe, attempting to provide medical attention and to revive him. As I said, due to the cold conditions, even though it appeared, it seemed apparent to the paramedics and others that John O'Keefe was already deceased at this time, due to the cold core body temperature, they would then go and see if they could warm his body up in order to see if they could revive him. Now, I'm just going to pause my recording here, as I just had an incoming call. And my apologies, I just had to take that phone call. So, as I was saying, I'm interested in what could be described as a false memory or false memories leaking into the evidence given at the trials. In fact, one of the police officers, who I'll discuss later time, to actually use the term she had a false memory, and I'll explain why I disagree in her particular description, according to my experience and my research. Others may disagree with me, but I'm going to explain that. So one of the key things that came out of my research, so this was my master's and PhD, was those that showed poor inhibitory control were significantly more likely to have a false memory. However, and the false memory was related to the intrusion of a word that was not presented to them during the study phase, but was presented as the target word during the test phase. And that word was related to the other words that they were shown during the study phase. So it's not a general memory error, it's a specific memory error. And a really important finding from my research was those that were more likely to have a false memory were not more likely to have other errors in memory. So they weren't likely, just because they had this particular false memory, that they would forget other words that were on the list. Their errors in forgetting were no different from those that had that didn't have the false memory, if that makes sense. So showing that the occurrence of a false memory in the way it was defined in my research was different from a general error in memory. So I want to give an example of this. So during the first trial, Timothy Nuttall, this paramedic, and who was one of the first on scene providing medical attention to John O'Keefe, he had testified. So the prosecutor during the first trial was Lowley, and he has been asked questions under direct evidence, and he testifies two things. First of all, he says he heard Karen say, "I hit him 2 times." And then he testifies that John was appropriately dressed for the weather and was wearing a thick, puffy winter coat. To joke about these puffer jackets and the long ones, they look like people are walking around in sleeping bags. That's my personal opinion. I'm not particularly taken to the puffer jackets. So that's what he says. Timothy Nuttall, when he approaches John O'Keefe, sees him lying on the snow, he determines he's appropriately dressed, and for the weather, which is a storm or snowstorm. This was forecasted. People in Canton and the wider Boston area were warned that the snow event was coming, and he decides that, well, he says in his evidence that he was appropriately dressed. What's really important to know is that Timothy Nuttall was first interviewed by disgraced former trooper Michael Proctor on the 8th of February 2022. So that's quite a few days after the event. So the death of John O'Keefe was recorded on the 29th of January 2022. Timothy Nuttall then gave evidence some months later at a grand jury trial, and this is different from New Zealand's legal system, and that the prosecutor will bring evidence to a grand jury trial. More often than not, my understanding is, I'm not a legal expert, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm certainly not a lawyer in America, but my understanding is that more often than not, the defense and the alleged perpetrator won't even know that this grand jury process is occurring. They find out after the fact. So present at a grand jury trial is prosecutor and whatever witnesses the prosecutor is going to bring. And then it's the grand jury who will then vote and decide whether the information presented to the grand jury would be sufficient for prosecution to go ahead. It's not compulsory for the prosecutor to go through the process of grand jury trial. I'm not aware of the different criteria for it or what makes that decision. But in this case, a grand jury trial was held, and Timothy Nuttall, along with others, gave evidence there. So he's given his statement, first of all, to Proctor, then he gives his evidence at a grand jury trial, then he gives evidence at trial number 1, and it's likely that he was also giving evidence during depositions. So that's when the defense lawyer or the defense team may depose him and ask him questions so that they will know what evidence he's going to give on the witness stand. So he's given it evidence 1, 2, 3, possibly 4 times. The fourth time would be trial 1. So at least 3 times by trial 1. So he has told the grand jury the statement that he heard Karen say, "I hit him 2 times." He he says it again in the second one. I will just check in a minute about exactly what he said during the grand jury trial, because I do have made notes of that. So, is it possible that when Timothy Nuttall says that John O'Keefe was dressed appropriately for the weather and that he was wearing a thick puffer jacket or thick, puffy winter coat, that this was a specific false memory that the puffer jacket or puffer coat or winter coat has intruded into Timothy Nuttall's recollection of what John O'Keefe was found to be wearing, because that would be related to what's appropriate to wear if you're dressed for a snowstorm. It may be the type of clothing that Timothy Nuttall himself may wear or had worn, given that they knew the snowstorm was to occur. And why that's important is that the facts are that John O'Keefe was not appropriately dressed for being out in a snowstorm. He was, in fact, wearing sneakers, black and white sneakers, socks, jeans, a t-shirt, and a thin cotton hoodie, not a thick, heavy polar fleece or chunky hoodie. And he had a cap on, so he didn't even have the hood pulled up. And there's multiple video footage of John O'Keefe that night showing the clothing that he was wearing. And at no time do you see him wearing a thick, heavy winter coat or puffer jacket. The clothing recovered from the hospital that John O'Keefe was wearing and the clothing that underwent forensic testing did not include a heavy winter coat. So this caught my attention and I sort of became interested, and I thought, well, that's possibly an example of a false memory, the type of false memory I was speaking about that I was interested in terms of my research. And that also then would alert to me that if that was a false memory and that has intruded into the information about this jacket has intruded into Timothy Nuttall's recollection, then it doesn't necessarily mean that I put aside anything else he says. Doesn't necessarily mean that he has a poor memory per se. He could be very accurate in everything else he says, but not accurate in this one example. But I'm not convinced that this is simply a specific false memory or intrusion into memory of what would make sense if he was appropriately dressed for the weather, that he would have this type of jacket on. It is my personal opinion, based on reviewing Timothy Nuttall's evidence given in trial number 1 and trial number 2, that something else is possibly going on for Timothy Nuttall. So I want to go to trial 2 now. So I'll just back to trial number 1. So Timothy Nuttall again gave evidence in trial number 1, and that was central to Lowley's case, because in trial number 1, Lowley introduces Kerry Roberts and Jen McCabe early on hearing that morning. They claim that Karen Reid had told them that she had hit John O'Keefe with her vehicle, that she, in her hysteria and distress, says, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. In fact, Lowley says that when they returned to John O'Keefe's home that morning, this is prior to finding John O'Keefe at Fairview Road, 34th Fairview Road, that as they arrived back at John O'Keefe's place, that the ring camera footage the ring camera footage, that's what I'm going to tell you about. Lowley says that as they arrived, Karen Reid pointed out to Jennifer McCabe and Kerry Roberts that her tail light was not just cracked, it was broken and pieces were missing. So he's saying that they stood at the back of her Lexus and she's pointing out, look, see, it's broken, pieces are missing, it's because I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. Whereas the ring camera footage does not verify that. The ring camera footage, in fact, shows they walk past the rear of Karen's vehicle. They do not stop. They don't even seem to have a conversation. They just walk immediately into the house. You can watch that yourself. Go back to the trial channel. there under the evidence that the trial channel presents. You will see that video. So it's a big link in this case, which is why I'm focusing on it, because Jen McCabe claims, Karen Reid says, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. Kerry Roberts says she heard Karen say, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. And in the first trial, Timothy Nuttall says he heard Karen Reid say to him, I hit him twice. Okay, so in trial 2 now, Timothy Nuttall says, Karen tells Timothy Nuttall, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. So now it's 3 times. It's gone from 2 times now to 3 times. So we'll come back to that, but I want to just point out to you what was said by Hank Brennan in his opening statements in trial number 2. So in trial number 2, I just want to come back to it. Let me just find, it's around 25 minutes and 30 seconds. He's asked by Hank Brennan, this Timothy Nuttall, he's asked, was he addressed appropriately for the weather? And he says, yes, he had several layers of clothing on. He's also asked, in his opening statement, it's Hank Brennan who says that when Timothy Nuttall is crouched beside John O'Keefe and he is providing CPR, he looks up at Karen Reid and says, what happened? And Karen Reid, this is Hank Brennan's words, Karen Reid says to Timothy Nuttall, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. So in response to Timothy Nuttall's question, what happened, Hank Brennan says as an opening statement to the jury that the evidence will show that Karen Reid responded to Timothy Nuttall's question, what happened, by stating, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. So then I want to go to cross-examination. So if you go to the opening statements for trial 2, this would be around 3 minutes and 28 seconds. And he's been asked, Timothy Nuttall has been asked by Alan Jackson, questions about clothing and the removal of clothing. Now they're talking about John O'Keefe's body being in the ambulance and they need to assess his injuries and how clothing would be removed. And he's asked directly by Alan Jackson, how would you do that? And Timothy Nuttall says, well, typically you would use specific scissors that they would cut the clothing off, that they would not disturb the body or try to minimize disturbing evidence by trying to remove clothing. But in this case, he's asked about, well, what about if it's a big puffy jacket? And he says, well, if you tried to cut the big puffy jacket, it would make a big mess in the ambulance, and that just wouldn't be appropriate. So the majority of these puffer jackets, which seems to be what Timothy Nuttall has in mind, are often stuffed with not just Dacron, some cases they're stuffed with like goose down, feathers, etc. So if you imagine cutting that open, it's just an explosion of stuffing. So in this case, the puffer jacket was removed. We would remove the puffer jacket, and he makes a statement, not just like generally we would do that. He states it was removed, and it was at that time when the jacket was removed that they noticed his hands were quite rigid. That's John O'Keefe's hands. So Timothy Nuttall suggesting that the puffer jacket was like covering or masking John O'Keefe's hands in such a way that when he was in the snow, they hadn't noticed that. Once the jacket was removed in the ambulance, they now noticed that. He repeats again, Alan Jackson repeats again. So when you remove the big puffy jacket, that was when you could better assess his injuries. And Timothy Nuttall agrees. AJ again, it was only then after you removed this big heavy coat, you could assess his hands. Timothy Nuttall. We noted his hands, but it wasn't until we removed that coat that they came into light. Now, this is not a direct transcript. This is just my notes. So if some of my wording is different when you listen or watch the footage yourself, don't hold me to it. These are my notes, my personal notes that I've taken. So AJ, Alan Jackson, but you remember him having a heavy jacket on. Timothy Nuttall, correct. Alan Jackson, and you remember that, like you remember the other, you remember that, so you remember that information, the heavy jacket or the puffer jacket, like you remember the other specifics of the incident. So Alan Jackson is linking, well, if you remember that, it's just like you remembered others. That's how you lay down the memory trace. You're looking at specific pieces of information and what's occurred, and the puffer jacket is part of it, and Timothy Nuttall agrees. And AJ, Alan Jackson, sorry, often going AJ because he's often given that nickname, AJ. So he goes on to say, well, part of what you would do, this is Timothy Nuttall, as you arrive on the scene, you're going to assess multiple things that you're trying to understand what's occurred, what are the injuries, what might you need to do for this patient. So you're going to take into account the scene, is the person lying on a hard surface or a soft surface? Are they inside or outside? What are the weather conditions? And he gives the example, if you find a naked body in the snow, that's going to tell you something or alert you to something different from if you find a fully clothed, appropriately dressed body in the snow. And again, he comes back to, it's because you were assessing all of this that is when you remember the heavy coat. And Timothy Nuttall, yes, I remember he was appropriately dressed. So he's repeating this. This is not the first time he's repeated his statement. So this is really solidifying. And then Alan Jackson says, in fact, you testified to that in the grand jury. So Alan Jackson's reminding Timothy Nuttall that during the grand jury trial, he said the same thing. So he said it in his statement to Proctor, says it to the grand jury trial, he says it in trial 1, he's saying it in trial 2. So we've got at least 4 times, possibly 5 or 6 if you take depositions into account. And Timothy Nuttall agrees, and Alan Jackson says, so that's consistent with how you are testifying today. And Timothy Nuttall says, yes, what I told the grand jury is consistent with what I've told you today. Alan Jackson turns away and he asks if he can show Timothy Nuttall 2 photographs. And if you watch this, you can see Timothy Nuttall go, what photographs are you going to show me? You can sort of see that look on his face as he goes, okay, you show me a photograph. So Alan Jackson shows Timothy Nuttall 2 photographs. And I was really caught by the change in facial expression. As you can sort of see, there were a couple of things that I noticed. The Timothy Nuttall's eyes are starting to dart around a bit. His facial expression conveys concern or worry. It's like he's thinking, what's going to happen? What have I said? What's coming up? And he's shown 2 photographs, and these appear to be, the jury's not shown them, the photographs only Timothy Nuttall, and they appear to be items of clothing that were put into evidence. The t-shirt, maybe, but certainly the cotton hoodie. And Timothy Nuttall is asked, does that appear to be what John was wearing? This is where my alarm bells start to go. Now we get Timothy Nuttall saying, I don't recall, sir, to be perfectly honest, prior to this, under his direct examination, and all of Alan Jackson's questions about the puffer jacket, he was confident. There's no hesitation. His voice is calm and steady. He gives a confident response. He's shown the photographs. Now he's not certain. Now he's confused. His eyebrows are raised. The forehead, his skin on the forehead is furrowed. His eyebrows are really high, and you can see that could be thinking, could be concern. And I noted that at 47 minutes and 35, his expression changes. He does this sort of sideways glitch when it's sort of like, oh, okay. Like literally, oh, okay. When he looks at the photograph, it's like, oh, okay, so there's no puffer jacket. It's my inference from watching him. He again says he doesn't recall what John O'Keefe was wearing, whereas previously he states he does recall. He said that to the grand jury, he said it in trial one, he said it in his direct examination, and now under cross-examination, when he's confronted with the photographs that do not include this puffer jacket, now he's saying he doesn't recall not just the puffer jacket, but what John O'Keefe was wearing. Doesn't recall the hoodie, doesn't recall the t-shirt, doesn't recall the jeans or shoes, etc. He's saying, I don't recall what he was wearing. And then Alan Jackson asked, do you remember someone cutting this off John O'Keefe? So that's referring to the t-shirt, and well, I think it's the t-shirt, but definitely the hoodie. Timothy Nuttall, I remember the clothing being removed, and now distancing himself. I remember it was removed, and he's not saying, well, I remember so-and-so removed it, I saw so-and-so do it, or I did it. He's saying, I remember it was removed. So a little bit of distancing going on in his answer here. Alan Jackson, but you don't remember this clothing. So specifically, he's asked specifically this clothing. Timothy Nuttall, I can say he had clothing removed, but I couldn't tell you exactly what that was. So again, reiterating his distancing himself. He'd been specific under direct examination. Now when he's confronted under cross-examination, now he's not being specific. Now his memory and his recall has become questioning. And Jackson, does that appear to be a thin cotton hoodie? Timothy Nuttall hesitates, and he's looking at the photograph, and he goes, that appears to be a thinner layer of clothing. So remember, to Hank Brennan under direct examination, he said he was appropriately dressed with layers of clothing. And to Alan Jackson, layers of clothing. So now again, this distancing, he says, well, it appears to be a thin layer of clothing, which would then suggest that possibly he's saying, well, he would have had something over top. He's still like hanging on. There must be this puffer jacket. And Alan Jackson, not a heavy coat. Is that fair? So this thin hoodie, no, it's not a heavy coat. Is that fair? Timothy Nuttall, that goes fair. Not a winter jacket, fair. So clarifying what the outer layer that was John O'Keefe was found in, this thin cotton hoodie, is obviously not a heavy winter jacket. So at 49 minutes 25, Alan Jackson starts to give Timothy Nuttall a bit of grace, and he says, well, it's fair to say you had a lot on your mind, you had a lot to deal with. You're dealing with someone who appears to be deceased and needs urgent life-saving intervention, CPR, ventilation, etc. So that's what you were focused on, and Timothy Nuttall's agreeing to that. So maybe what the victim was wearing was not your focus, and your memory might be a little faulty. And then Alan Jackson goes on, well, you notice this, you notice this, you notice this. And he's gently sort of challenging Timothy Nuttall in his statements around, well, my memory's faulty. And my understanding is where Alan Jackson is going with this is saying, well, you're the paramedic. The condition in which a person is found, not just weather conditions, what they're wearing, may be really important to what may have happened, and how you intervene. So now telling us that you don't really recall what clothing is wearing doesn't quite make sense, given it's a snow event, given that you were so adamant to say he was appropriately dressed for the weather, and now you're saying you don't really remember what he was wearing. Okay. So then Timothy Nuttall's asked about injuries, and he's asked, because Alan Jackson's linking all of this together now. You noted trauma to the right side of his head. Timothy Nuttall goes, yes. And then he clarifies, it was at the front side of the head above the eyebrow. And he goes like this. He indicates with his hand to the right side. I realize this is reverse, so this may look like the left side. So it goes like this, to the right side, and it's not to the right side of the head. He's going above the eyebrow to the right side, and he holds his hand to his head, like an instinctive. This is what you do. You're recalling it in the moment, so you're putting your hand. So the action here is consistent with what he's recalling. So Alan Jackson corrected it it's to the front and not to the side, and he agrees. Yes, it's above his eyebrow, and again uses his hand to indicate the location. And then Alan Jackson, but you didn't note injuries in his, and this is Timothy Nuttall's report, you didn't note injuries to the back of his head. Timothy Nuttall agrees, no. Apparently there was a significant injury and a laceration, quite a long cut, and this is where John O'Keefe had been bleeding from the back of the head, and that wasn't noticed by Timothy Nuttall. It wasn't in his report. Timothy Nuttall says correct. And then Alan Jackson goes on to the right arm, and this was fascinating. I really do recommend that you watch this on Trial Channel's footage. So remember, the injuries to John O'Keefe were above the neck and to his right arm. There were no other internal or external injuries, bruising, fractures, etc. from here down. So Timothy Nuttall's asked about the right arm, and Alan Jackson uses Timothy Nuttall's own words that he's given and other evidence. He said, Timothy Nuttall said, they appeared to be scratches. Your words, not mine. Timothy Nuttall, correct. Not blunt force trauma. So again, imagine if you're struck on the arm by the back of a reversing vehicle, that would be considered blunt force. And so Alan Jackson's really highlighting this, that the paramedic who's noting the injuries describes them as scratches, not blunt force trauma. Timothy Nuttall, no. Not abrasions, no. Timothy Nuttall, scratches and abrasions do sort of go hand in hand. So you can have scratches, abrasions being like the skin's been, something rough has gone up against the skin, possibly causing a graze or damaging the surface of the skin. So you could have scratches and abrasions. So they could go together. Alan Jackson, but the word you used was scratches. So he's saying to Timothy Nuttall, you specifically used scratches. You didn't describe these as abrasions or grazes or laceration. You used the word scratches in your report. And Timothy Nuttall goes like this. He says, yeah, like furrows, scratches. And he does this action as he's describing. These are like furrows, like scratches. And he drags his fingers across his arm as if scratching his arm. And Alan Jackson brings attention to this, and he says, when you said that, Timothy Nuttall, when you said the word scratches and furrows, your hand was almost like a claw as you dragged it across your arm. Now, there's an objection to this, and Alan Jackson tries to continue, and he asks Timothy Nuttall, can you make that movement again? Because he actually does it twice. You'll see it on the video. He does it twice. That's my recollection. Maybe that's a false memory. He does it at least once. And I'm pretty sure he does it twice. And he's asked, can you repeat it again? But Judge Bev, for those who know, says, I will not allow that. Move on, Mr. Jackson. So, not, I'll allow that. No, I will not allow that. Move on. So Alan Jackson goes back to the injury over the right eye and suggests it's consistent with a punch. Okay, so where we're up to. Let's move on again, because he goes back to, and this is really, really interesting. There's a lot, I've taken a lot of notes here. Alan Jackson runs through a whole series of questions where he's noting that it didn't take long for Timothy Nuttall and the other paramedics to remove John O'Keefe from lying on the snow to being in the back of the ambulance where they had access to equipment, etc., to provide medical treatment. So very quickly, Timothy Nuttall is in the ambulance. He clarifies that Timothy Nuttall is at John O'Keefe's head and he's working on the ventilation. He's not providing CPR, as contradicting what Hank Brennan said in his opening statement, that for some reason Timothy Nuttall's kneeling beside John O'Keefe's body. My understanding from listening to the opening statement by Brennan was the inference there was that was outside the ambulance, that was immediately beside him. And you will actually see one of the paramedics as they move or transfer John O'Keefe from the ground to the ambulance. You can see there is a paramedic who is doing CPR, manual CPR. And this apparently is not Timothy Nuttall, despite what Brennan says. So Alan Jackson clarifies that Timothy Nuttall is in the ambulance, ventilating, so working up at this area of John O'Keefe's body, and Karen Reid, Jed McCabe are outside the ambulance talking to police officers. Now, remember the claim. Jen McCabe has claimed that Karen Reid has already said to her that Karen Reid says, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. And she's not saying that happened at the scene where John O'Keefe's found, but Timothy Nuttall and then another firefighter paramedic, Katie McLaughlin, say that Karen Reid does say it at the scene. Now, there are police standing there. There are police on site. There are various professionals that you would think, if Karen Reid is running around or screaming to people, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him, somebody's going to react and they're going to go, what the heck is she saying? Or we better pull her aside and interview her. This is potentially how he died. You'd think the paramedics would be interested in this, because if she hit him, what was she talking about? Did she use a weapon? How did she hit him? If she's not saying I hit him with my car. All they're saying is she's saying I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. And yet nobody reacts. You can see that. And when Karen Reid has been spoken to, and Jen McCabe and Kerry Roberts outside of the ambulance, Timothy Nuttall's not there. He's inside the ambulance. There is dash cam footage that you can watch that shows us, and this was shown to the jury. You can hear the windscreen wipers. You can hear muffled noises of people talking, but you can't actually hear. At times you could hear Karen Reid running around screaming, and she's going, John, and she's like, is he dead? And she's going, Jen. But at no time do you hear her scream, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. So Alan Jackson then goes on to say, she asks, so this is different from what was said in opening statements, different what's said elsewhere. Alan Jackson says, so while you were in the ambulance, this is to Timothy Nuttall, you look outside the ambulance and you turn towards Karen Reid and you ask, do you know him? So this is a different question, not what happened. Do you know him? And Timothy Nuttall says, and she answered, I hit him, I hit him. So completely different, not what happened, I hit him, I hit him, but now, do you know him? And she's saying, I hit him, I hit him. And Timothy Nuttall says, yes. And then Alan Jackson goes, but that's not what you told Trooper Proctor when you were interviewed on the 8th of February 2022. So in the days after John O'Keefe's death. Timothy Nuttall, I don't recall. And his eyes are darting backwards and forwards. And I'm interpreting that as he's trying to go, what did I say? What did I say? What was it I said? Did I say the same thing? What have I said? He could be searching his memory, but he could also be looking a little bit nervous. And I see both. Do you recall, Alan Jackson, do you recall that while you were rendering aid, you heard Karen say to another female? So this is what apparently Timothy Nuttall was told Proctor during this interview, that he heard Karen say it to one of the females, whether it's Karen or Jennifer, not to himself. So he's told the grand jury it was directly to him. He's told Hank Brennan it was directly to him. He's told Alan Jackson it was directly to him. But we suggested as a clinical psychologist, information given earlier is likely to be more accurate than information that's given later because of the intrusion into memory of other factors or distortion of memories or memory errors, etc. So Alan Jackson really sort of hammers that. And then Timothy Nuttall says, as I stated, I heard a number of times I hit him. As to who that was said to, I don't know. So again, the pattern, when confronted, it's gone from being confident in his answer, it was to me, was an answer to me, she said it directly to me. Now he's saying, well, I don't know who she said it to. And he's told, this is a change from what you said earlier. That's not what you testified to earlier today. Timothy goes, okay. And so that story's changed from you posing a question and she answered to you correct. That's what you first have been saying. You asked a question and she answered you. And he goes, correct. So which one is it? Did she say it directly to you, an answer to your question, or did you hear her say it to someone else? And Timothy Nuttall, so which one is it? So Timothy Nuttall says, so when I'm tending to a patient, I can turn around and quickly ask, do you know him? Alan Jackson goes on, do you agree your testimony today has changed from your statement to Trooper Proctor on the 8th? You're saying today it was said to me, to Trooper Proctor on the 8th of February 2022. You said it was said to someone else. I don't know. I don't know if it is so much change, sir. I don't fully recall that meeting with Proctor. So again, distancing, saying I don't recall. So Alan Jackson, so your memory is a bit faulty? Timothy Nuttall saying yes. So he's agreeing my memory to multiple things is faulty, not specific to the buffer jacket. So remember, I was querying whether that was a false memory as I define a false memory in my research, as opposed to he's just got faulty memory. And now he's saying, well, actually, I made multiple errors. I don't even really know what clothing he was wearing. I really don't know who took the clothing off. I don't even know who said it, whether it was said to me directly. Did I ask a question? So remember, that's not the pattern I found. Those that were more likely to have a false memory were not also more likely to have other mistakes in their memory. In fact, they were just as accurate as those who did not have a false memory. So this is where I would find, if this was a person in my study and they're now making just multiple errors in memory, including a false memory, I would have excluded them from the study because I can't say as inhibitory control per se, or they just got a bad memory. So in my study, those that had poor inhibitory control did not have a general problem with their memory. They were just as accurate. They weren't making more mistakes than others, but they were in terms of the false memory, suggesting it's related to a specific neuropsychological or neurocognitive process. So the point of this video, looking at the difference in testimony between witnesses, not only in terms of their direct examination, but cross-examination. I'm also looking at differences between trial 1 and trial 2, where you see things change. So for Timothy Nuttall, what was concerning on day 1, this is day 1 of trial 2, version 2, this is April 22nd, 2025. He has to admit on cross-examination that he'd been incorrect about John's clothing. He'd been incorrect saying he was appropriately dressed for the weather, and he was incorrect in saying that there was a heavy winter coat or puffer jacket, that in fact he was found wearing a t-shirt, a thin cotton hoodie and a t-shirt. He also has to admit that he was inside the ambulance, and this was verified by others. So Timothy Nuttall was inside the ambulance with John during the time that other people claim to have heard Karen scream, "I hit him, I hit him, I hit him." So Kerry Roberts, Jen McCabe, Katie McLaughlin. Dashcam footage was shown of Timothy Nuttall as he was moving with the stretcher back to the ambulance, as Karen, Kerry, and Jen were standing talking with the police. Later during the trial, as more footage was shown, it was evident that none of the police or ambulance officers reacted to anything Karen said. As I talked to her, they weren't going, "Oh, I think this woman's drunk. She seems intoxicated. She's slurring her words. This woman's had too much to drink. She's not making statements that suggest that she has acted in any way to cause." No one's reacting to Karen Reid. And in fact, if you watch the footage carefully, it is Jen McCabe who spends most of the time talking to the police officers, often off to the side, away from Karen, so that Karen isn't hearing what Jen McCabe is saying. And it is my opinion that this is from this time, or before even Karen arrives at Jen McCabe's house that morning to look for John, Jen McCabe is already taking a lead role in manipulating information to start pointing the finger at Karen Reid. And she's actively doing this on scene before John O'Keefe is even taken to hospital. So, as I said, this leaves the question: if Karen was as drunk as Brennan claims during his opening statements, and she's screaming loudly to multiple people that she caused the death of John O'Keefe, why didn't the police process her for driving under the influence? In fact, the only concern anyone had for Karen that morning was for her mental well-being due to statements that she wished she was also dead. Hence, she was taken to hospital and assessed by a psych team. Karen's medical record after that psych evaluation states she was not psychotic, she was not mentally unstable. Rather, her medical notes state she was experiencing acute grief reaction, which is described as an immediate reaction to loss involving intense feelings of grief, anger, guilt, and also characterized by behaviors and emotions that a person would not normally display. And later during trial 2, another expert witness talks about the acute grief reaction and how it is not uncommon for someone who's lost a loved one to make statements, "It's my fault, it's all my fault. If only I did this, I shouldn't have done this." It's very common. And in fact, it is the defence claim and Karen Reid's own claim that what she actually said was, could I have hit him? She's asking the question, could this have been my fault? Could I have hit him with my car? Because she's not sure what's happened. Under acute grief reaction, Karen running around hysterically. She's not crazy. She's not psychotic, as Matt McCabe seems to suggest. She's actually acutely distressed at finding her boyfriend, someone she loves, someone she was angry with that night for not being able to contact him, thinking he's deserted her, drinking and partying and left her alone. She's really distressed. And here we see how right from that, this is hours, in the early hours of the 29th of January 2022, already information has been manipulated, statements being made, Jen McCabe's talking quietly with the police, Kerry Roberts goes on her own to pick up the O'Keeffes, John's parents, to take them. So Kerry Roberts already stating that Karen Reid saying, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. And she's going to tell that to the O'Keeffes, and the O'Keeffes immediately turn against Karen. So when Karen is taken to the hospital due to concerns for her mental well-being, not because she's drunk, or they want to process her potentially for DUI, or they want to hold her because they think she's caused John O'Keeffe's death. They're worried about her well-being. And when Peggy O'Keeffe sees Karen, the girlfriend of Peggy's son, says, what's she doing here? So already within hours, Peggy O'Keeffe's turned against her. And remember, Peggy O'Keeffe was taken to the hospital by Kerry Roberts. So in wrapping this up, my question, did Timothy Nuttall experience a false memory? I query that. I can't say definitively, but it does not fit the pattern. And I appreciate extrapolating from an experimental design and from research to an individual account. I can't do that 100% with confidence, but it's the pattern I'm looking at. So rather than he's accurate on everything else, and it's just this one piece of information he's not accurate on, the puffer jacket, because that would be appropriate for the type of clothing that someone might wear if they're preparing to be out in the snow. Timothy Nuttall's not accurate on multiple things, suggesting to me that that is not a false memory, suggesting to me that when confronted, because remember, it's not when on direct examination that he starts to question his own memory. He's very confident. It's when he's challenged by Alan Jackson. He's shown photographs, when he's reminded of what he said in previous testimony to a grand jury, to Trooper Proctor, disgraced. That's when Timothy Nuttall starts to use language to distance himself, to say, well, I don't really recall. So he's gone from being confident under cross-examination, not confident under cross-examination. Hence, the reliability of Timothy Nuttall's evidence, in my mind, is questionable. And I wonder what it was like for the jury on day one to watch and listen as the defense on the first witness, this is day one, Timothy Nuttall is first witness. Hank Brennan starts his opening statement by talking about what it was like for Timothy Nuttall to get the call that there's been a cardiac arrest, and as he runs to grab his bag, and Hank Brennan gives this really dramatic setting the scene with Timothy Nuttall right at the centre of this, right at the start. And here we go, right out the gate, the defence going, well, you're not correct on that, you're not correct on that, not correct on this, and actually you weren't doing CPR, you were doing the breathing. And I'm wondering what the jury were thinking. I'd love to have been able to ask them. No one could. Some are given interviews now, but I wonder what they were thinking that in that moment, as the first witness is now put under question, cross-examination, and shown that multiple statements are just not accurate. So I'm going to leave you to think about that, because this is day one. And I'm just going to give you a warning that this happened all the way through. Witness, witness after witness after witness. Hank Brennan said in his opening statements in trial number 2 to say, this is the evidence I'm going to show you, jury. Did not play out in terms of the evidence that was given. And under cross-examination, the pattern, which is why I'm interested as a clinical psychologist, is that accuracy and confidence seem to be apparent under direct examination. When challenged under cross-examination, multiple witnesses had to concede they were incorrect. Something they said happened didn't happen. Something they said they heard they didn't hear. And even what John O'Keefe was wearing, he was not. So leave it there. If you've watched this, thanks very much for watching. And we'll come back because Kerry Roberts is next. And that girl lights it up.